MVP, prepared for and presented at the 2017 Square One Entrepreneurship Training Program. Square One is a program of the Center for Emerging Technologies. CET is an affiliate of the Cortex Innovation Community. Square One is funded in part by the Missouri Technology Corporation.
So you guys, it's going to be a little bit difficult to keep track of me. I'm going to ask quite a few questions, well, not quite a few. I'll ask a few questions, and hopefully I get some participation. So this should be a collaborative event. I learned from you, you learned from me, and that's best case scenario. So I'll go through each line, and I'll probably ask one question. Can anybody in this row tell me what they're working on, just on a high level, and just who's willing to say that? Anybody? Just very quick, just like a very quick one line.
Social directory?
Social directory, okay. All right, and you're early on, I'll assume, first step?
Yes.
Okay. This line, can anybody on this line just tell me what you're working on?
Working on neuronavigation platform.
Neuronavigation platform, cool. And early stage, mid stage? Okay. Can somebody on this line tell me what you're working on?
An end-of-life docu-media management company.
End-of-life docu-media, okay, interesting. And what stage are you in, early stage?
Development.
Development, okay. Someone in this row, could you tell me what you're working on? Just high level, could be, okay?
Insulated kitchen product to remove hot pans out of the oven, whether your hands are wet or the product itself is wet.
Insulated kitchen, okay, that's cool, interesting.
Safe.
Wow, very good. What stage, early stage?
We're in prototype stage.
Prototype stage, okay.
Scheduling after school activities for kids.
Okay. Scheduling after school activities, okay. Pretty cool. And your early stage?
We are in the development stage.
Development stage. Last line? Are you guys okay?
My product is a frozen food.
Oh, sorry?
Frozen.
Frozen food, okay.
Yeah, the product is a curry puff, and my stage is packaging and marketing.
Packaging marketing. Very interesting, very interesting. Everybody here is in a different stage, at least generally speaking. Generally in between the early stage, mid stage, and everybody I've heard has different ideas. Hopefully I can give you something, you can learn something depending on, regardless of the stage you're in. Does anybody know what an MVP is? Minimum viable product. That's a good, see, it sounds so catchy. I mean, minimum viable, sounds so technical and so catchy, doesn't it? Minimum viable product. Anybody know what it means? I'm going to look for definitions.
What product you can have out that can at least start generating revenue, regardless of whether it is
Interesting.
where you want it to be.
Interesting, the revenue component. So he says it's a minimum to generate revenue, which is a good approach. And I'll go into the detail as far as, but keep that in mind, and everybody keep in mind what he said. The minimum you need to do to generate revenue. And just remember that. We'll get to the details of that, but I don't want to dive deep into the revenue is not a necessity. I'll just say that. But you were looking at a validation. Revenue could be a validation so it's called minimum viable product in the sense that you're trying to create the minimum product to reach a validated response, something that you can validate. And if revenue is what you're using as a validation, that could be, I mean, if you think about it in that sense, on a small scale. So let me just give you a little bit about myself. I've been involved with startups. I've started about 4 companies. Started mostly, depending on the stage, started Locker Dome. Some of you might know that. Started Push Up Social, mostly in the social space. In most of those cases, actually in all those cases, I created the prototype, right? And they all began in either a basement or in my apartment. Literally, all of them. They all began there, sitting down, working, but they all came up with, they all started, and essentially it was the minimum viable product I built, right? So I have a little bit of experience understanding this, mostly in the field experience, I'd say. And in all cases, we went on to raise some capital, we hired teams, and the companies, some of them are existing today. Sorry? Yes, I acted as a developer, the initial developer. I created the prototype, and then we ended up getting some funding, and then we ended up building teams. So and this is going to be broader, so it's not just going to be technical, and hopefully applies to everybody here. But what types of startups are there? So we have different types of startups. We have the lifestyle startup. Now, lifestyle startup is usually the type of startup where you build to sustain a lifestyle. So let me give you an example. I could be a surfer. Now, how would I, as a surfer, maintain that surfer lifestyle? Okay.
Well, you can sell videos of yourself surfing.
That's perfect. That's a good one. That's a great one. So you could become a video. You could sell those videos. You create like an online, and then that would sustain your. Now that's a good example. Another example would be, say you're a trainer, a surfing instructor, right? And in which case you also, as part of your lifestyle, you're also doing the act. So sustaining your life and you're surfing, right? So I'm surfing and I'm also doing the actual training. So in which case you have a surfing and it's a lifestyle startup. That's the concept would be you're doing what you love and also sustaining it with financing, which you could be a trainer. Another example, most cases I'd assume applies to everybody in here, or to a lot of people in here are familiar with startups, like small business startups. And typically you have your grocery stores, you have most companies that they're providing a service or they're selling a product. And you're mostly familiar with most of these small business startups. Then you have the scalable startups. Most people are familiar with them, right? You're familiar with your Facebooks, you're familiar with your Instagrams, right? So in all of those cases, you have this product, right? And then the goal is to create a repeatable, something that you can repeat, something you can scale, right? So you create a business model that can be repeatable, you do it over and over, right? And then you continue to build those customers, right? A repeatable, scalable model. So most of them are in search of that. You have these high growth startups that keep looking for what can they have that they can scale. What component, and in a lot of cases when you deal like a Facebook, you're looking for the network effect, right? Or we're dealing with these high growth startups and saying, okay, what is that network effect? What is it that I'm going to build that I was looking at you, that Had can say, okay, John, Had can say, Benjamin, you do it too, right? And then Benjamin can say, Tanya, you do it too, right? And then Tanya would say, Wendy, you do it too, right? So that becomes a scalable, right? Considering it continues to grow, right? It's a scalable, so assuming that those are businesses, right? So assuming I'm a business, I'm selling to a Had, and Had is, telling another customer, Benjamin, and then Benjamin. Once they have that network effect, if you're looking at high growth startups, in the case of like a Facebook, a good example would be they build this user base and then there's a network effect after the users grow. Then you have another example is a viable startup where the concept is they're building a startup for the goal of actually getting into an exit. Very similar to a normal scalable startup, but the premise is I want to sell this company, right? So they might go in, say, and have an integration with an existing, like a higher net worth customer. So assume I say, okay, I want to sell, my goal is to sell to LinkedIn, right? I might build an add-on to LinkedIn, right? Or I might so my strategy initially might be, okay, I'm going to create my software tailored to, within the acquirer's scope, right? So that when they see me, it would entice a sale, right? Then you have social entrepreneurs. Anybody have a social entrepreneur here? Or I was trying to classify, I was trying to get a good look and see. Any social entrepreneurs? Typically in the social entrepreneurs, you're looking at people that have a social agenda, or I want to do this for this particular social goal. And those are the social entrepreneurs. And you also have like these entrepreneurs within a larger organization, in which case they have a division of the organization and they say, okay, hey, Amrin, I want you guys to innovate, right? Here's a small team. You guys build a product and innovate. Typically, larger organizations don't have that flexibility to innovate, right? So they can have entrepreneurs and startups within those divisions. All right, so this is a scary statistic for everybody in here, considering everybody has some sort of startup. 90% of startups fail. I mean, this isn't to scare you, it's just to be practical, right? So as you're looking at your ideas and you're coming up with your concepts, understand that 90% of them fail. Now, if I was to tell you, I'm a pilot, right? I'm in the pilot, and I'm before you're bored, I'm like, hey guys, there's a good chance. Hey, 90% of you guys, you know, hey, you're not gonna. How many of you guys would hop on board and fly? Probably wouldn't be, you know.
Yeah, if United you know you're good.
Hey.
That's actually not how it works.
There. Yeah. So that, I mean, hey, it's the facts, you know. So, but entrepreneurs are crazy. I mean, that's just a fact, you know. You have to. That's a distinguishing quality of all of us in here. We're pretty much, we're driven by our thirst to impact the world, and we're pretty crazy. We have this idea, and we feel we are so focused on it, and we believe that we can do it. But one advice for everybody, and most people forget this, you have to focus on your customers on day one. Now, like I said, I've been involved in different startups, and we've gone different routes. We focus on the product. We said, oh, we need to build this, we need to do this, we need to do all this. And we forgot the crucial piece of every startup. Everybody, all of our speakers prior hit on this. You have to focus on your customer, whether it's customer development, whether it's your interviews. You have to understand that the customer is the driving force of your company. And if all your efforts are aligned based on your customer, then your chances become a little less, you know, risky. Well, I would say every effort that you make should be customer focused. Whether when you develop a product, when you add a feature, when you're looking at, you should interview your customers, know what your customers want, and develop accordingly. I mean, you might have a vision of what you want to build, but your customer knows better because you're building it for your customer. At the end of the day, right? So understand that your customer is the driving force of your business. Focus on them on day one. I think our first speaker, John, he mentioned how each time they pivoted, it was based on customer or feedback from the customer or something they saw in the market and information they got from the customer. So they listened to the customer wasn't doing this, they figured, okay, we don't need this particular service. We don't need this connect because, you know, it was based on customer feedback. So one component of that is knowing your market. Now, John also touched on this, understanding that different times, you know, in the development of the company, they looked at a market and the market was changing. And they built their product also relative to the differences in the market. So you might be part of if you have a startup, you might be building a startup for an existing market, right? In which case, you have products already in that market, right? So you're dealing with competitors. So how do you distinguish yourself against your competitors, right? You need to be faster, you need to be better, right? So that's when you're in an existing market, right? Now, if you're in a resegmented market, typically that happens when the market already exists. You might have somebody that's captured the market, but it's been resegmented, meaning that there are different niches that you can approach within that market. An example might be social media, right? You might see a resegmenting in the market where you're saying, okay, I'm going to focus on sports in social media. Now that might be a niche that has very little development, and you're going to say, okay, as a product, I can provide, as a business provider, I can provide a solution in social sports media, right? Social media in the sports, in that niche. Now, you could also be approaching a product in the new market. Now, it's very difficult to enter a new market. There's going to be a lot of education of your customer because essentially you're telling your customer, listen, hey, guys, you don't want this, you don't know about this thing. Here it is, you know, it's new, you know, this is something you need, right? This is a new market, right? You're basically, there's a whole bunch of training you have to involve, you have to introduce you have to tell your customer why they need it. So it's a difficult proposition, It's not impossible, but once you enter a new market, you can be the leader, right? Relatively quickly, you can be established, right? You become everybody becomes you become the trailblazer. So understand as you build your companies, understand where your market is. That's a big component. Understand the type of your market. It shapes the type of product that you end up building once you understand the market.
When you're entering a new market and the space has been tried multiple times and it's seen a lot of failure, like what discredit do you take to those companies that have come before you? What do you try to learn from that?
So that would be an existing market. If it's new, I would just.
But everybody who's tried it has failed. The market within the market. Well, okay, so that would be an existing.
That would be existing, right? So the assumption there's no education to the consumer, right? So what you're telling me is that the consumer is particularly familiar with it. They might not like your solution, right? But
the customer never heard about the space that the other companies were in.
that doesn't that's a knowledge piece, right? So the customer, so that assumes. So what you're doing is you're saying, okay, here's your customer, a new customer. You're introducing a product to them, but that doesn't assume that the market wasn't there before, right? In your situation, what you're doing is you're expanding your customer base, right? You're saying, okay, John, a new John, here's the product. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay, so you're saying the customer did not know prior of this customer, of this space.
Sure.
So the space existed, but the customer did not know of it, right? So there's a re-education, or the customer has to be made aware of it. So, but you're not a trailblazer. Do you get what I'm saying? So essentially, you're just expanding your. Okay, awesome. Okay, so know your market. This is called the customer development process. It's I think Tanya and is it Tanya, the lady that presented before? Tina talked a lot about customer development. That was her focus. Customer discovery, particularly. Now, this is, like I said, typical processes in especially in product development, typically follow more of a waterfall process, right? And I'll just talk a little bit about it, where people create a product, and it's a very linear process. You build a product, you come up, you do your research, sorry? You test it, exactly. Ends up going to the testing. It's a very linear process. When you're thinking about the customer development, let me highlight the first two sections, because most startups fall into the first two sections, right? Where you're discovering your customer and then you're doing a lot of validation, right? So here's my customer. I need to validate what I think about the customer, right? Maybe I think the customer does this, right? Maybe I think the customer does this, right? I need to validate that. So that's an iterative section. So that's a search phase, right? So anybody, I can probably ask a few questions. Does everybody here think they know a lot about their customer, or is anybody in that phase? I would assume everybody is in that phase right now, right? Where you're trying to understand more about your customer, right? Okay, so you've identified your customer. So typically, when you're dealing with your MVP, you're in that stage, right? Your first stage of you're discovering your customer, and then you're validating. So you're making an assumption about your customer. Customer likes dog treats, right? I'm going to validate that, right? So how am I going to validate that? I'm going to build an MVP, the minimum viable product, and then I'm going to test that, right? So that's an iterative process. Customer likes something, I need to validate it. Customer, this I learned, and then I'm going to continue. So it's going to be a cyclical process, right? Now, most large, as a company grows, then they go into the execution phase. It becomes more, how do I scale that out, right? How do I increase my customers, right? How do I iterate? Then it becomes more. Then you go into the second loop, the iterative loop, where you're like, okay, I need to create more customers. I need to scale, right? And then
as you're building your MVP and you've identified your multiple customer segments, say you've got 6 of them or whatever, is it a reasonable assumption to build that MVP towards just one of those customer segments initially before you're trying to build,
Sure.
and then obviously because you're learning a little bit,
Sure.
in that first customer segment.
Sure, sure. See, so you've identified your customer segments, and then you're doing your
This
okay.
one would be the most
Gotcha.
profitable.
Okay. So have you identified your value proposition as well? How do those match? So you have to say, how do my customer segments map to the value proposition, right?
And reasonably, your value propositions are probably changing per customer segment. Right?
Right. So when you're building your MVP, ideally, it has to end up validating your product, what your goal is, right? So it's hard to not address all your customer segments and say that you built a true MVP, because it's
You did, yes. You built one towards one customer segment, right?
because it's very difficult to. I can give you an example. It's very difficult to do that because you haven't truly validated your product. Do you get what I'm saying? It's difficult to do it. I would say if I was going to, I don't know the details of your case right now. I would say do the smallest validation you need for each of them, and package that into your MVP. I wouldn't say go full force on the full you can go horizontal, you can go vertical. In that particular case, I'll say just do the smallest amount you need to do to validate each.
But the idea of, say, your customer segments being various business-to-business partners that are asking for a different qualification of
See,
inside.
okay. So here's me being broad in that solution.
Yeah, so I'm just
Okay.
this customer segment
So,
assessment.
okay. So I mean, it's very difficult without full knowledge of what your particular case. But generally speaking, I would try to get as much validated learning with my MVP, right? So I'll try to learn as much as I can about the product with the first iteration, right?
You're making a bowl of spaghetti if you're like trying to cater to all these customer segments, right?
Well, that depends on if you can give me more details on what you're building. So if it depends on how that applies. Now, let me give you an example. So if you're dealing with let me give you the example of Best Buy or eBay, right? eBay is a good example where you have buyers and you have sellers, right? Now, if I created a solution that only catered to the sellers, now that wouldn't solve the problem, right? That would.
And you need both those customers.
Exactly. Now, you can't really say, okay, that actually is a validated solution, right?
But what if eBay was selling to dogs and cats and people and horses and pigs and saying, like, we're going to do our product for...
That's in that particular case.
Of course eBay first.
So in that particular case, you're looking at more of your business as a whole and saying, strategically, how would I approach a specific niche and then iterate? Because I mean, it wouldn't make sense in that particular case to say I'm going to solve all problems. I would say approach a specific niche, right? Dogs, right? And then iterate on that. Get a proof of that, and then iterate, right?
Maybe, associatively, cats are like similar things.
Exactly. So, no, but it's a good question. Design thinking. This was not in the last presentation, and I'm just going to skip over this because they're generally the same. They're similar concepts. And we did talk about this. What is the MVP? So the MVP is the minimum viable product. Is a version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort, right? So the goal is the least effort, right? You want to create something that you don't put all your eggs in the one basket and end up realizing that you're building the wrong basket, right? You want the least amount with the minimum effort, right? So that's your MVP. And the particular piece is validated learning, in which case you initially said revenue, right? Where revenue was.
This long time that always seems to be this.
So revenue might be validation, right? So if I have an idea, say I have a business idea, right? Say it's dog foods. how do I prove that dog treats is valuable to the customer, right? How do I validate that assumption?
And if your value proposition was they're super tasty and dogs love them, then you're having to eat the treats and it's nothing to do with creating revenue.
Well, yeah. I mean, it could. Yeah, exactly. So that could be exactly. So the taste could be the validation, right? So the validation could be the customer said that this tastes good, right? Now, if there's a purchase requirement to prove the value of your product, then that might be a requirement for your MVP. Saying that, okay, this is important, so I need to prove it's important by requiring somebody to buy it, right? So I build something, might be the minimum, but the end goal would be a purchase, right?
Reasonably, maybe it's then not revenue creation, but user onboarding or something.
Exactly. Another goal might be user onboarding, right? So a goal might be, for my MVP, might be I need to prove that people are going to be onboarded, right? So in the end of the day, is the minimum amount of effort for validated learning, right? So you need to learn at the end, right? And that has to be validated, minimum viable product, and the viability being that validation, right? So is it viable? How do I judge whether it's viable or not? Okay, I'm validating it by X, right? Is viable because somebody bought it, right? Is viable because it onboarded, right? Is viable because X, right? So
Is it necessary for it to be validated by someone to purchase it when you're thinking about trying to get funded and capital?
no. Like I said, that's not a necessity. So you have to determine as the business owner what that viability is, right? So if viability is revenue or if viability is onboarding. Onboarding being somebody's going to register to use it, right? So in your case, you have your card, right? Somebody doesn't necessarily have to buy it, right? They might just become a user. They might say, okay, I want to use it, right? Somebody just become an interested, and they can at some point transition to a customer, a paying customer. But the first step for you is to prove that they might just onboard. You might just get the customer interested, right? So that might be what your MVP is, right?
Question. So if you're trying to develop your MVP, how much, so usability, right, is such a huge factor depending on what you're trying to build. So if you take Uber, for example, right, it's so impactful because the simplicity behind it. All I have to do is get out the car, right? It charges my car. So the simplicity piece of it. So if you're trying to develop your MVP, I can just take what my struggle is. So I'm a developer, so I'm like, oh man, I need to make this screen this way.
Yeah.
Oh no, I need to make these colors this
Yeah.
way because so that's my drawback
Sure.
instead of just moving forward versus, how can I make this UI UX design informative as well as powerful with a single click. That's one of my drawbacks.
Okay. So what you're saying is, at what point what is the level of usability that would?
Because in some cases the usability piece is huge for the MVP, right?
Sure.
So let's say
But that's
the Uber example,
Exactly.
you had to register and do this and do that, and, get call the bank to verify that, it wouldn't be as useful.
Sure. But the question is, what's the minimum, right? So I think there's that's a qualitative. Essentially, how do you qualify that? What in your mind? What does it? And essentially, it's not really a question that you would particularly. It depends. It's a question that ideally is customer backed, right? So I know in your mind you say I need to do all these things. As a developer, you want to do all of them, right? And you say this is at this point is going to be perfect, right? But it's not there yet. I still need to add this, right? I need to add all these things, and it's perfect, right? Keep in mind that your goal should always be customer focused, customer based, right? Now, if you talk to your customer and they tell you this is what I need, that should be the basis of your decision making, right? So you've said, okay, my customer needs this, I need to prove this, right? My minimum viable product needs to prove this. How do I get to that point? With the least amount of effort so I can test it. Because it's going to be an iterative process. Just remember that it's an iterative process, meaning that you might start this way, but you're going to change. It's going to grow, right? So you don't want to do all of this and then find out that they don't need all these things. They might just need this thing, right? So do this thing and then say, okay, maybe they didn't need this. Let's try this, right? And then, okay, they did need this. Okay, let's add this, right? Oh, they didn't need that. Okay, let's go back. But you don't start with the whole thing and then say, oh, what? You didn't need any of that, right? You go through the entire time spending $1 million, how much money, and they didn't need any of that at all. So.
Don't let perfection stand in the way of progress. Eventually, you have to launch something. Analysis paralysis, my friend.
And it's very unlikely.
It won't kill you.
It's very unlikely that your design choices will ever impact whether or not someone feels it solves a problem for them.
Yep.
At least at this early stage. Like no one's gonna not use it based on like you chose the wrong color of gray.
Yeah.
At this point, right? It's all about functionality, right? So anybody that you're giving MVP to, any user, probably understands that, right? And they understand that they're bearing a little bit of a burden to try these MVP.
Yep. Very good points. Very good points. Okay. So why do you need an MVP? I think most people know why you need it. I mean, we kind of covered a lot of these. And the biggest first point was what we said. You don't want to build something people don't want, right? You don't want to be in the situation where, heck, I've done all this stuff. Now they don't even want it, right? I spent all this money. They don't want any of it. I mean, they might say I spent all this money. They might need this bit. They might just say I don't want any of it. And then you just have to throw it all away and then start again. Now the problem is, typically, the irony is that all this is relatively, especially in the IT sector, relatively new. Well, I say new, and I say within 2020, the 2000s, as far as the lean startup methodology, taking root. Typically, what you'd have businesses go through the entire development cycle, build this entire thing, end up introducing it into the market 3 years later, and then waiting for the customer to respond, right? And by that point in time, there might be new technology that makes the entire thing obsolete, right? So best case scenario, you create something that's small, introduce it to the market while the technology matches, learn from it, and then iterate, right? You have the agile methodology as well that kind of leans to this, agile, being able to change as the market changes. Also maximizes the amount of dollars you spend. Obviously, like I said before, you don't spend $1 million or however much money building something that you can just introduce with if you thought however much, right? And then you get the facts before it's too late. And you can also use your customers as, I think we touched on this, as kind of research assistants, where they can tell you a lot about your product because they use it, right? And like I said, in the old days, people would build something full-featured, introduce it to the customers without customer feedback. Now, customer feedback is a crucial piece of the development process, right? So I ask my customers what I want, and I iterate based on what they tell me, right? So I can use the customers to drive my development process. Yeah, most of these are kind of self-explanatory. I mean, it allows you to achieve big vision in small increments, and you get to continuously change the product as you learn from the market, right? So the market teaches you, and you get to iterate on it. Now, a crucial component or a crucial theory behind this is the build, measure, learn loop, right? So you build, you measure, and then you learn, right? And this basically applies to your MVP. This applies to your development process. Okay, I have something I build, which is the prototype or your MVP. I ask my customers, I learn from them, and then I measure it basically, and then the loops around. How effective was it? What did I learn from it? And then you build some more, right? And then you continue to iterate. And then I measure, and then I learn. Yeah, so it's a continuous loop. Okay, so this is going to lead into some of the strategies that you have as a building your MVP. And this probably will touch on some of you guys specifically. So if you have your businesses, regardless of the stages you're in, you might use one of these strategies when you're building your MVP. First strategy is the explainer video. Now, the explainer video is basically a video that tells about your MVP. You don't, your product, right? In which case, you don't build the product. You just basically tell the user about it in video format, which can essentially be an MVP. Most people aren't. Most people say, "Oh, is that an MVP? Really?" Yeah, it is. you can create a video, and I'll show you examples where somebody used that as a strategy for an MVP. They use an explainer video to explain about the product, introduce it into the market, solve the response, and then they iterate it based on the user's response. Now, you can have a landing page, which is used. Another way you can use that is I'll touch on details of these as well as far as the strategies go. You have the Wizard of Oz. This is an interesting one, where essentially what you're doing is if you know the story of anybody know the story of the Wizard of Oz here? Okay. Okay. So at the end, I don't want to spoil for everybody else. But there's a piece of it where there's something, the Wizard of Oz, is, I'll touch on that in more detail, I guess. I really don't want to spoil it for everybody else, just because. So it's everything isn't as it seems. How about that? So that's the theory behind it all. It's while you might see all the pieces, it's not necessarily all there. Then there's a piecemeal MVP, which basically is everything is put together, similar, kind of conceptually similar. Crowdfunding, which is basically you crowdfund it on the front end, get the revenue, get money, and then basically implement at the end. So you basically do your proof of concept by saying, okay, what do customers want? Do the customers actually want this? Oh, they're gonna fund it, right? And then you use that as your kind of your proof to build. Single featured MVP basically would be a scenario where you just build one feature set, you use that to prove kind of a model, and then iterate on it. And I'll talk to you about, I'll give live examples of it. Explainer video. So good example is Dropbox. I don't know if anybody here knows how Dropbox started. Okay, perfect. Look at these, perfect examples. I can't see a name there. Yeah. Do you know, can you tell a little bit about it? Okay, just okay. Okay. Put you on the spot, didn't I? Okay. So Dropbox used this explainer video strategy beautifully. They're known for this strategy. So the founder created a video basically showing how the product would work before the product was actually finished, right? He shared it online, and so I'll read through the problems, you can read it, I guess. So they faced the problem, they're creating a new market, right? Nobody was doing file sharing, basically what they were doing, especially not cloud-based. They had high costs to execute the application. File synchronization between multiple platforms required an army of engineers, and they needed feedback from customers. So they created this video, right? Like I said, without actually implementing majority of the feature set, they created a video showing it working, showing it in motion, right? Just showed people how it worked, right? And they got thousands of people to register to sign up for it. And that just proved the concept. That proved to them that, okay, this is needed, right? That's all I needed. That's the minimum viable product. Minimum viable in the sense where the viability in their case was onboarding to show basically that I could get people to use the software. And with this feature set, right, I've proved that with this medium, the video medium, right? They use that, and that was enough for them to garner interest, garner funding, essentially, and start Dropbox, which is used now by, well, lots of people. I don't know how many people use Dropbox here. Oh, hey.
What's important to remember is it showed them how it would work if they built it. They didn't build it and then do an explainer video. They did an explainer video using animation of theoretically, if I clicked here, it would do this. There was no application at all.
So how do you determine your feature set?
So, ideally it's customer based. And exactly, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. In some cases, you are the customer, right? So in which case, I mean, in the case of a new market, right, it's very difficult in the new market. I said it, it's very difficult when you don't necessarily have an existing competitor to model after, right? Where you can say, okay, these are the things I need to do better, right? In which case you're like, okay, I'm on uncharted territory. People are going to be coming after me. I'm not going to be following after somebody else, right? So in which case, in those cases, the driving force in those decisions essentially are the founders, the people that started, right? Because, I mean, it has to come from somewhere, right? Ideally, it's customer-based. And it could be just an assortment of people that they know, where they say, okay, but just as far as the initial development, it's a lot more difficult when you're entering a new market, and when you're trying to prove to people why this is important. She wants to.
This explains the reason why you want to do this as an explainer video instead of building out a whole product, because that way, if you're wrong about the features, okay, no one clicked on my video, but I didn't spend lots of time building the actual application.
Yeah, but this has to be on minimum at that point. So if you are your customer stripped down to the minimum you think you can do, not your maximum, your minimum.
How did they share that video? Like what did they use?
They put it online. I believe they used, I forget it might have been YouTube or something. I forget exactly how they shared it, but they shared it to publicly. And I think they also had on their initial, I don't know, I can't tell you specifically. It's totally, I might have remembered it a while ago, but not recently. 12? Okay, so the second one would be a landing page. Like I said, the minimum you have. Now, in which case, and this is a perfect example, where the founder of Buffer, which is basically a social media queuing application, what they did was they created this landing page. Now, this wasn't a website. Essentially, it says, hey guys, once you come to my website, why don't you register for something that doesn't actually do anything? Why don't you register for a service that doesn't actually exist right now, right? Now, people went to the site, they registered for it, and they used that concept as their MVP. All they did was they proved that people are going to want the service after it was created. Now, that was the minimum and the validated learning was the onboarding, right? So people are going to want it. This is what it's going to do, right? Now, that could be a strategy that you implement. I'm going to create a landing page. I'm going to use that as my MVP, and then I'm going to iterate on that.
How much value do you think you place to people that are pre-registering for your product? I couldn't see
That's a good. I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, the question as far as value, they are good early users and early.
They'll at least be beta testers.
Early beta, exactly. So, which is perfect. I mean, that's not necessarily all you might need, right? The perfect people to give you feedback, right? So.
Yeah, with no advertising there.
Exactly.
And
So.
I think the Simon Sinek video was part of the things I sent you this time, and if you watch that, it has the arc of who you need to convince. You need your early adopters. You need your early adopters.
So this was a perfect example, and they registered to use it. So landing page. Now, the Wizard of Oz is exactly like the story I do not want to tell to spoil that story for everybody else. So Zappos, I'm sure everybody knows. Anybody not? I guess. I mean, no, let me not put that in the spot. I'm assuming some people know Zappos here. Now, Zappos, most companies would have their inventory in-house already. So if I was going to start, well, not most. Let me not say that most, because I mean, in the past, you'd have your store, you'd have inventory, and then you'd sell it, right? Now, in the case of Zappos, they didn't have the back end. So imagine the Wizard of Oz, right? Without the actual Oz, right? So showing you have all the glitz and glamour up in front without the actual back end. In which case, what he did was he went to the stores, took pictures of the shoes, and basically used that as to test if people would want to buy it, right? So the interest, so what they did for the MVP wasn't actually, at some point they built the back end, but initially, proof of concept of people actually going to buy it, validate that, and then iterate, right? So what's the least amount that they did was they took the pictures. Concierge, I'll touch a little bit on this. So the founder of this company basically created a concierge service what they did was, I can read it to you. Food on Table is a company that provides weekly recipes and groceries based on the sales. Before building, he interviewed shoppers until he found one interested in their service, and then he created like a concierge service, in which case he would be he created a premium service for the customers, right? So he went to them, he found out information about them, and then used that basically to determine the fullness of the product, right? So I might act as I might say, okay, as a concierge, I might go to you, and then the more detail I find of this, specific customer, he used that to build out the feature set of his company. So he created like a premium service. He had it at $9.95, and then based on that, he used the insight to build his to scale the company. Piecemeal MVP, Groupon. I'm sure a lot of people know about Groupon. Their initial solution was actually a mix of WordPress, a whole bunch of different things they used to build it. WordPress, Apple Mail for mailing, Apple Script, PDFs. So their solution was basically, we're not going to spend all this money building this entire feature set, right? Or we're just going to use things that currently exist, right? I'm going to use this from here, this from here, this from here, and this from here. And using all these things, I'm going to build a service that I can provide as my minimum viable product, right? What's the least I can provide to a customer? Crowdfunded, we talked about this. Pebble is probably one of the good ones. They wanted to know if people would buy the product. They used crowdfunding as a source of validation. They gave people invested, people paid for it, and that proved that there was a market, and they used that as an MVP strategy. Yeah, they ended up raising $10 million, I guess, which is great. It's a great MVP. I know, right? It's great. Yeah. Single featured MVP is a good example is Foursquare. Foursquare basically just started initially as a check-in app. People would check into the social networks and they just created one feature, very simple. Do it, check, test if people want to use it. And then based on that, they use that validation to expand to the services, and now they do a whole bunch of other things. So that's it, guys.
There's time for a few questions.
Tony.
So I have two questions. So for the non-technical founders, what are some resources out there that they can use to build things like a landing page or hash together some sort of MVP? And then the second question is, at what point do you engage developers? Or where can you go? Because everyone's saying there's so many resources and saying, well, this, but I've been on this. Someone who's not technical, it's really difficult to figure out who to talk to, where to go.
Now, there are a lot of non-technical tools, especially website builders. In today's day and age, you have lots of website builders. You have your Wixes, you have your Weebly's, and for a lot of non-technical people, you can actually create a website with little technical knowledge, right? So that's the first question.
More so like the apps.
Okay. So you're talking about the landing page, or because it's?
Well, it's not just the landing page, but if you want to build some sort of like app, I just don't have a sense of what's out there.
Okay. So the first question would be, what is your MVP, right? So I think the first is identifying that for yourself and saying, okay, based on that, what are the resources I need to build that? Have you identified what your MVP is going to be?
I have a sense of what I would like to.
Is it an app you're building? So you're looking to build a prototype, or are you trying to build? Because we gave a couple of strategies. You could build a landing page. You could build explainer video. You don't necessarily have to have the bells and whistles to test.
I have to go back and think about it because I hadn't considered that I could.
Sure. Okay. So my suggestion would be that identify what that is. After you've identified that, then you'd have more of a strategy as far as options, right? So. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thanks.